It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in Ridgeview, a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. The air had the crispness that marked the arrival of early autumn, the kind of day that suggested everything would proceed as it always had, quiet, predictable, and calm. James Carter, the owner of Carter's Café, wiped down the counter, his routine familiar and comforting. His café was the heart of Ridgeview, a place where locals gathered to share coffee, stories, and sometimes, opinions. The smell of fresh-baked pastries and brewing coffee filled the air, a scent that felt like home to anyone who stepped through the door. James had inherited the café from his father, and for the past 15 years, it had been a sanctuary for the town's residents. It wasn't just a place to get a warm meal or a hot drink, it was a gathering point, a place to connect, a place to belong. James had always prided himself on keeping it that way, neutral ground in a town that could be divided on just about anything else. His policy was simple: everyone was welcome. Whether you supported the local sports team or backed the town's occasional protests about various political issues, if you walked through his door, you were treated with the same respect. But that morning, as he put the last of the dishes away, there was a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't the usual hum of morning chatter that greeted him, instead, it was a murmur of voices, low and tense. He stepped outside to see a group of people gathered on the street corner, pointing at the sign on the door of his café, a new addition that hadn't been there the day before. A simple white sign with bold red letters, "No guns allowed." James froze. The sign had been placed on his door by order of the Ridgeview City Council, a rule that had been passed the previous week and was set to take effect immediately. It was meant to be a safety measure, an attempt to curb the rising tensions between pro-gun and anti-gun groups in the town. At first, James hadn't thought much of it. He'd been told it was mandatory, a formality, a rule that all businesses were required to follow. There hadn't been much of a discussion about it, just a piece of paper handed to him by a council member with a note that read, "Please post this in a visible spot." James, ever the pragmatist, had done as he was told. He never anticipated that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, would ignite a storm. As he walked closer to the group on the corner, he could hear their voices rising. Some were muttering, shaking their heads. Others were angry, their voices laced with disdain. "He's one of them," a man said, his face flushed with anger. "This is just another way to control us." James recognized the man as Tom Williams, a local who had been known for his outspoken views on gun rights. Tom wasn't the only one upset, half the town seemed to be in an uproar. Ridgeview had always been a community where firearms weren't just part of everyday life, they were a symbol of independence, of self-reliance, and of the rights people held dear. Guns were a part of the town's culture, whether it was hunting in the fall or the annual 4th of July parade, where veterans proudly displayed their firearms as part of their service to the country. A gun-free zone? It felt like a betrayal to many, and James felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. "I didn't make the rule," James said, stepping into the crowd, trying to quell the rising tension. "It's not my decision." But no one was listening. They were too caught up in their anger, their frustration. "I just put the sign up because I had to," James added, his voice firm but apologetic. The murmurs died down for a moment, and then Claire Dawson, a woman known for her fiery opinions and passionate advocacy for gun rights, stepped forward. "You're a coward, James." "A sellout," she said, her voice cold and biting. "You're just going to roll over and let them take away our rights? You should have fought this." James swallowed hard. Claire had been a friend once, someone he'd had beers with at the local bar, someone who had celebrated with him when his daughter, Emily, was born. They shared a mutual respect for each other's opinions, even when they didn't always agree. But this was different. This wasn't a casual debate about politics. This was personal. People were angry, and their anger was focused on him. "I didn't have a choice, Claire," he said, shaking his head. "It's law now. I have to follow it. I'm just trying to keep this place running." His words felt hollow, even to him. They didn't explain the real struggle he was facing, the pressure of trying to keep the cafe open, trying to keep his employees employed, trying to keep his customers happy. Ridgeview wasn't a wealthy town, and the cafe had always been a fragile business, barely making ends meet. This new rule felt like a blow that might push it over the edge. The conversation continued to spiral, voices growing louder, accusations flying. But all James could think about was how quickly things had shifted. Yesterday, his cafe had been a place of warmth, of comfort, of connection. Today, it had become a battleground. Inside, the cafe was quiet. The usual hum of conversation had been replaced by the sound of footsteps on the wooden floors, the clinking of coffee cups being set down with too much force. Emily, his daughter, stood behind the counter, her face pale. She was only 16, but she was already taking on more responsibility at the cafe than James had ever expected. "Dad, what's going on out there?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's fine," James said, offering her a forced smile. "Nothing we can't handle." But the words felt like lies. As the day wore on, the protests outside the cafe grew louder. Claire's group had gathered, holding signs and chanting. People were divided, taking sides. Some supported the idea of keeping the cafe safe from firearms. Others, like Tom, wanted to preserve their right to carry, to defend themselves as they saw fit. Ridgeview, a town built on shared traditions and common ground, was now a place of deep division. The evening brought no relief. The protests continued into the night, with people hurling insults, trying to convince others to join their cause. James had to close early, the cafe empty of customers except for a few regulars who silently sipped their drinks, unwilling to pick a side. But it wasn't just the protests that weighed on James. It was the phone calls, the ones from longtime customers who now refused to step foot in his cafe. It was the looks from friends, people who once supported him and his business, now casting him as the enemy. That night, as he locked the door to the cafe and turned the sign to "closed," James felt a deep unease settling in his gut. It wasn't just the immediate anger that concerned him, it was what it would lead to. This small decision, the posting of a simple sign, had set off a chain of events that was beyond his control. People were angry. The town was divided. And James? He was stuck in the middle. As he walked to his car, Emily caught up with him. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I don't know," James admitted. The truth was, he didn't have the answers. Ridgeview was a town full of passionate people, and it seemed that everyone had an opinion about what was right. But in the middle of all the noise, one thing was clear: James had unwittingly become the face of a much larger debate, one that he wasn't sure he could win. And as the anger outside continued to build, James knew this was just the beginning. He looked at his daughter, her young face filled with worry, and made a decision in that moment: he was going to have to navigate this storm, not just for his cafe, but for his family, for his town. He wasn't just fighting for a sign. He was fighting for the very soul of Ridgeview. The following morning, Ridgeview woke up to a town that felt different. The sun rose over the hills with its usual golden glow, but there was an unusual chill in the air, an energy that wasn't typical for this tight-knit community. People moved through their daily routines, but there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate everything. The protests that had started the day before continued, now with an even larger crowd. James had never seen Ridgeview so divided. It was as if a line had been drawn in the sand, and no one was sure who was on which side anymore. Inside Carter's cafe, the atmosphere was heavy. The usual rhythm of the morning, coffee brewing, chatter filling the air, the sound of the register opening and closing, was now interrupted by the noise from outside. Customers filtered in, their faces tense, their conversations hushed. No one knew what to say, how to approach it. The regulars who once came in for their morning coffee and friendly banter now came in with furrowed brows, avoiding eye contact with one another, stealing glances toward the windows, where the crowd outside had gathered. The protesters, who'd now set up signs and organized chants, were visible from every corner of the cafe. Some of them were holding up signs with slogans like, "Protect our rights," and "No compromise," while others waved flags and shouted slogans that mirrored the fierce polarization overtaking the town. Emily had arrived early that day, earlier than usual. She stood behind the counter, nervously cleaning the same cup over and over again, as if that could calm her racing thoughts. The cafe had been her father's refuge, her sanctuary, but now it was feeling like a battleground. She glanced up at her father, who was wiping down the counter with a cloth, his eyes cast downward as though he was lost in thought. James had always been the solid rock of the family, calm, collected, always knowing what to do. But today, it was different. Today, he looked uncertain, and that uncertainty seemed to spread like a disease, infecting the air in the cafe. The tension was palpable, but it wasn't just the protests outside that bothered James, it was the strain it had placed on his relationships with the people in his community. He had received phone calls, messages, even angry letters from people he'd known for years, telling him that his decision to put up the sign had been a betrayal. They told him he was weak, that he had sold out, that he had chosen the side of the government over the values that had built this town. Each message, each confrontation, was like another weight being placed on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who did what was right, even when it was hard. But this felt different. This wasn't a simple decision, like choosing whether to stay open late for the town's 4th of July celebration. This was something deeper, something that went to the heart of what Ridgeview stood for. For many of the townsfolk, guns weren't just tools, they were symbols. Symbols of protection, of freedom, of their right to make decisions for themselves. And now, James had unwittingly become a symbol of everything they thought was wrong with the world. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. He glanced over at Emily, who was still fiddling with the cup in her hands, her face full of worry. He hated seeing her like this. She had always been his rock, the one person who never doubted him. But now, he saw that doubt creeping into her eyes. "Dad, do you think this is going to get worse?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. James sighed and set the mug down, his fingers lingering on the edge of the cup. "I don't know, Em. I really don't know." They stood there in silence, the low murmur of voices from the protest outside filtering in through the windows. The front door swung open, and in walked Claire Dawson, her expression hardened, her eyes narrow. She didn't even acknowledge James as she made her way to the counter. The room went silent, everyone turning their heads to look at her. Claire was known for being outspoken, her passion for her beliefs was as fierce as it was unyielding. But even James had never seen her so fired up. She placed a large bag on the counter with a thud and turned to face him. "James," she said, her voice low but filled with contempt, "you've gone too far. You've betrayed every person in this town who believes in their rights. You're nothing but a pawn for the government now. You've let them win." James felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't the Claire he knew, the one who had always been ready for a heated debate but had always done so with respect. This wasn't the Claire he had shared drinks with at the bar after long days at the cafe. This was a different side of her, a side that James wasn't sure how to handle. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Claire," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's a law. There's nothing I can do about it. I didn't choose sides. I'm just trying to keep the cafe open. I'm just trying to survive." "Survive?" Claire scoffed. "By selling out? By giving in to pressure? That's not surviving, James. That's giving up. I thought you were better than this." James clenched his jaw. "I'm not selling out, Claire. I'm trying to keep this place running. This town has already been divided. People are angry, and I'm just trying to get by. Claire stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with frustration, and then she turned on her heel, marching out of the cafe. The door slammed shut behind her with an audible force, and the room fell back into an awkward silence. James took a deep breath and looked at Emily, who had witnessed the entire exchange. She didn't say anything, but the worry in her eyes was clear. "I'll handle it, Em," he said, his voice a little weaker than he intended. "I'm doing the best I can." But in that moment, he didn't know if it would be enough. The community was falling apart. What was once a town where everyone knew each other was now a place of deep divides, where friendships were fraying and loyalties were being tested. The cafe, once the neutral ground, was now a symbol of that divide. People who had once walked in and out of the doors as if they belonged were now standing on opposite sides, glaring at each other, whispering behind backs, judging each other for the choices they had made. As the day wore on, the protests outside only grew more intense. The noise, the chanting, the shouts, it was like a storm had descended upon Ridgeview. James knew that if this continued, it could get out of hand. But as much as he wanted to be the calm in the storm, he felt himself being pulled into the chaos. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, there was a knock on the cafe door. James looked up, his eyes narrowing. Standing outside was a man he didn't recognize, tall, with a rugged face, a jacket that looked like it had seen better days, and a stern expression that suggested he wasn't here for a friendly chat. He motioned for James to come outside. Taking a deep breath, James pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the unease in his gut. The man looked him up and down. "I'm here about the sign," he said, his voice low but commanding. "We need to talk." James stood frozen for a moment. He had no idea who this man was or what he wanted. But something about the way he spoke made it clear that this wasn't just another protester or concerned citizen. This was someone who had a message to deliver, one that James wasn't sure he was ready to hear. "What do you mean?" James asked, his heart beating faster. "We need to talk about the consequences of your actions," the man replied, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "And I think you'll want to listen." James had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was certain, this was just the beginning. The storm that had been brewing in Ridgeview had only just started, and James wasn't sure how it would end. The tension in Ridgeview seemed to escalate by the hour. It was as if every person in town was either on one side or the other, and there was no room for anyone to stand in the middle. The protests, the debates, the confrontations, they were everywhere, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. James stood on the porch of his cafe, staring at the man who had just shown up unannounced. The man's stern face revealed nothing, but the way he carried himself suggested he was more than just a concerned citizen. There was an edge to him, a purpose in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure who you are," James said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes fixed on James like a hawk. "You're James Carter, right? The owner of Carter's Cafe?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly tone. James nodded, his stomach tightening. He had a sinking feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be good. "I'm here because of the sign," the man continued. "The one you put up at your cafe. It's causing more trouble than you realize." James frowned, his mind racing. He had expected to face more backlash from the town, but he hadn't anticipated someone coming out of nowhere like this. "I know it's causing trouble. Believe me, I never wanted this," he said, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "But I'm just trying to stay open, to keep this place going. This isn't what I envisioned." The man studied James for a moment, his expression unreadable. You're right about one thing, he said slowly. You didn't expect this. None of us did. But the problem is, you're in the middle of something much bigger than just your cafe. James blinked, confused. What do you mean? I'm just a business owner. I don't have anything to do with all this chaos. The man's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he stepped forward, lowering his voice. You're right about that, too. You didn't cause it. But you've become a symbol, James. And symbols carry weight. Whether you like it or not, you're part of something now, something much larger than you or your cafe. And I'm afraid, if you don't understand that, it's going to get worse. A chill ran down James's spine. The last thing he had wanted was to be part of something that could spiral out of control. He had only made that one decision, to put up the sign, because he thought it was the right thing to do, a necessary action to comply with the law and keep his business afloat. But now, this man was telling him that his actions had set off a chain of events that were beyond his control. I'm just trying to survive here, James said, his voice quiet but firm. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to keep the cafe open, to keep the people of Ridgeview coming in, having their coffee, talking to each other. I never wanted to tear this town apart. The man nodded, as though he understood the frustration in James's voice. I get that, he said. But the problem is, you're not the only one who's been affected. This town is divided now, completely. The lines are drawn. There are people who are supporting you, sure, but there are just as many who think you've betrayed everything they stand for. And that's going to lead to conflict. Real conflict. James's mind raced, trying to process what the man was telling him. He had seen the signs, heard the whispers, but it was becoming all too real. This wasn't just about a sign or a cafe anymore, it was about Ridgeview itself, about the community, about values that had been in place for generations. And it was slipping away. I didn't mean for this to happen, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's already happened, hasn't it? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past James, toward the growing crowd outside. It's already happening, he said, his tone ominous. You're stuck in the middle, James. And no matter what you do, people are going to see you as one of them. The ones who gave in, the ones who compromised. And that's going to be harder to undo than you think. James stood there, trying to make sense of it all. How had it gotten this bad? One simple decision, one small action, and now the entire town was falling apart. He could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, heavier than any burden he had ever carried before. The man seemed to sense James's growing anxiety. Listen, I didn't come here to make things worse, he said, his tone softening slightly. I came here because I think you can still do something about it. You're not completely helpless, James. But you need to understand what's at stake. You need to think about what you want this town to be, what kind of man you want to be in the eyes of everyone here. James took a deep breath, his mind spinning. Could he fix this? Could he undo the damage that had already been done? He didn't know. He didn't even know where to begin. All he knew was that the choice he had made, the simple act of putting up a sign, had placed him at the center of a conflict he had never expected to face. The man's eyes locked with James's. Think about it carefully, James. You can't go back now. But you can still make a difference. Just don't wait too long, or it'll be too late. With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without another word. James stood there for a long time, the words echoing in his mind. Too late. Was it too late? Was there a way to fix things, to bring the town back together before it was torn apart for good? The sound of raised voices brought James back to reality. The protests were louder now, the chants more forceful. He glanced toward the cafe, where Emily was still inside, watching him from the window. She looked worried, her face pale as she watched him stand frozen in the doorway. James's mind was racing. Could he make things right? Could he find a way to heal the rift that had torn through Ridgeview? He had no answers. All he had were questions, and the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him with every passing second. He walked back inside the cafe, the door creaking behind him as he stepped over the threshold. The noise from outside seemed to grow louder, but it was almost as if he was deaf to it now. He had to do something, but he didn't know where to begin. Emily met him at the counter, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what had just happened. "What did he want, Dad?" James took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in his mind. "He wants me to make a choice. A real choice. Not just for me, but for the town. But I don't know what that choice is, Em. I don't know how to fix this." Emily reached out, placing a hand on his. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." But James wasn't sure. Not this time. This was different. This wasn't just about running a cafe or keeping the doors open. This was about the very heart of Ridgeview, and he wasn't sure how much of it could be saved. Outside, the protests continued, the noise growing louder, filling the streets of Ridgeview. It felt like the town was on the edge of something big. And James knew, deep down, that the next decision he made could change everything. The days following the confrontation on the cafe porch were nothing short of surreal. Ridgeview, once a town of quiet simplicity, had transformed into a battleground of conflicting values and emotions. James spent sleepless nights sitting at his cafe's counter, staring at the walls, his thoughts swirling like the steam rising from his half-empty cup of coffee. He couldn't escape the weight of the decision he knew was coming. The town was at a breaking point, and he was right in the center of it. The once familiar faces of his regular customers now seemed distant, as if a wall had risen between them and him. The protests outside his cafe had only grown louder and more aggressive. Every morning, as James opened the door, he was greeted by a handful of protesters, some for, some against, arguing passionately about the sign that had caused it all. It was a simple message, really. A sign placed in the window stating that Carter's Cafe would adhere to the new law, a regulation many in town found controversial. It wasn't anything new to James, but it had set off a firestorm of conflict. Some felt betrayed, others felt vindicated. The more vocal group believed the sign represented capitulation to outside forces, an erosion of what Ridgeview stood for. It was a symbolic declaration of weakness. And to James, it felt like a slap in the face. Every morning, the tension was palpable. James could no longer walk down Main Street without hearing whispers or seeing angry stares. Even his closest friends had started to distance themselves. The tight-knit community he had once known felt fractured, like a puzzle that was slowly falling apart piece by piece. He was caught in a tug-of-war between two sides, each one seeing him as a symbol of something they either feared or despised. And yet, despite the growing pressure, James had a hard time shaking the feeling that there was something else at play here. As the days passed, he started to notice small things, glances exchanged behind closed doors, hushed conversations when he walked into a room. It wasn't just about the sign anymore. It was about what the sign represented. It was about power, control, and fear. The news outlets had picked up the story, and Ridgeview had become the subject of heated debate on local and national television. They spoke of a divided town, of a cafe owner caught in the middle of a political firestorm. People across the country weighed in, some supporting James for standing by the law, others calling him a traitor for letting his business be used as a pawn in a larger game. But the media, with all their headlines and buzz, didn't understand the weight of it all. They didn't live in Ridgeview. They didn't know the people, the history, the years of shared experiences. They didn't understand that James wasn't trying to make a statement, he was simply trying to keep his family's business alive in an increasingly volatile world. The pressure continued to build until one morning, just as the sun rose, James received a visit that would change everything. The knock on his door was quiet at first, a polite but firm tap that broke through the stillness of the early hours. James opened the door, still half asleep, and found standing before him a man he recognized instantly. "Deputy Collins," James said, surprised. "What brings you here this early?" Deputy Collins was a man in his late 40s, a veteran of Ridgeview's small police force, known for his calm demeanor and impartial nature. He was a man of principle, one who had always kept his personal beliefs separate from his duties. James had always respected him, and Collins had always supported his café, even stopping in for a cup of coffee now and then. But today, there was something different about the way Collins stood there, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. "James," Collins said, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk." James gestured for Collins to come inside, his heart suddenly racing. He had no idea what this visit meant, but he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. As they sat down at the small kitchen table, Collins looked at him for a moment, as if measuring his words carefully. "James, I know you're caught in the middle of this mess," Collins began, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "But I need you to understand something. The situation here, it's escalating. The protests, the violence, it's getting worse by the day. And it's not just about the sign anymore. It's about control. Power. People in this town are starting to get desperate. They're looking for someone to blame, and right now, that's you." James felt a chill wash over him as he absorbed Collins's words. He had known that things were bad, but hearing them from someone like Collins made it feel real, like the walls were closing in on him from all sides. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," James said, his voice tight with frustration. "I just wanted to keep the cafe open. I didn't ask for all of this." Collins nodded, a grim look on his face. "I know. And that's the problem. You didn't ask for this, but it doesn't matter. You're a symbol now, James. People see you as a threat, as someone who's either with them or against them. And that kind of division, it's dangerous. You've seen the protests, right?" James nodded. He had seen them, heard the shouting and the chanting, the anger in the streets. "Yeah. It's been getting worse every day." Collins leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's not just protests anymore, James. It's starting to spill over into violence. People are getting hurt. And I'm afraid that if things don't change, it's going to get worse. I don't want to see this town torn apart over something like this." James's mind raced. He had never wanted violence, never wanted anything more than peace and stability. He just wanted to run his business and live his life, but now, he could see that his actions had set something in motion that he couldn't stop. "What do you want me to do, Collins?" James asked, his voice thick with helplessness. "I don't know what to fix. I don't know how to fix this." Collins paused for a long moment, staring into James's eyes. "You have a choice, James. You can keep fighting, stand your ground, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost this town, and it might cost you everything you've worked for. Or, you can walk away. You can take down the sign, admit you were wrong, and try to heal the rift. But that's not going to be easy either. People are angry, and they won't forgive you right away." James felt his chest tighten as the weight of Collins's words settled on him. The choice was impossible, and yet it was right there in front of him. He could stand firm, continue to defend his decision, and risk tearing apart his town, his friends, and his family. Or he could concede, back down, and try to patch up the pieces. But would that really fix anything? Would it truly heal the hurt and betrayal felt by so many? "I need to think about this," James said quietly. "I need time." Collins nodded, standing up to leave. "I know. But whatever you decide, you need to decide soon. People are getting more desperate, and they won't wait forever. As Collins left, James sat there, his mind reeling. The town was on the edge of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And he was the one who had set it all into motion. The responsibility was crushing. Every decision from here on out would affect not just him, but everyone he cared about. The door closed behind Collins, and James sat alone in the silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him harder than ever. There was no easy answer. He had a family to think about. He had a community to protect. And he had no idea which path would lead to peace, if any at all. He ran his hands through his hair, staring out the window at the protesters still marching down Main Street. The sun had set, casting a dim light across the town. Ridgeview was at war with itself, and James had no idea how to stop it. The following days felt like a blur for James. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of distant shouting, the protests outside his cafe more intense than ever. People had started gathering earlier, forming small groups that would chant, hold up signs, and pace back and forth in front of his business. They weren't just strangers now, they were his neighbors, his regulars, people he had known for years. Friends who, in the face of a controversial law and a single sign, now saw him as an enemy or a coward. Ridgeview was no longer the small town he had known, where everyone had looked out for each other. Now, it felt divided, a rift growing deeper by the hour, with no clear way back. James had always prided himself on being a peacekeeper. He didn't want trouble, didn't want confrontation. The sign in the window had been a way to ensure that his cafe could stay open, that the business his father had built wouldn't crumble under the weight of political battles that didn't concern him. But as the protests escalated, as the pressure mounted, it became clear that it wasn't just about the sign anymore. It was about power, influence, and control. He hadn't expected the confrontation with the town's residents to go this far. All he had done was try to comply with what was being asked of him, what was being demanded. The law was law. He hadn't wanted to take sides, he had just wanted to run his cafe. And yet, he was now at the center of something that was quickly spiraling out of control. On the 5th day of the protests, things took a turn for the worse. James had been trying to keep a low profile, focusing on his work in the cafe, hoping that the chaos would eventually die down. But when he opened the door that morning to see a crowd of protesters blocking the entrance, he knew that wasn't going to happen. They had started to gather even earlier, and today, there were more of them than ever. They weren't just holding signs anymore, they were shouting at the top of their lungs, their anger palpable, directed right at him. The sign, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their eyes, was now the focal point of their rage. "Traitor," one man yelled, his face red with fury. "You've sold out, James. You don't care about this town, about what's right." "Take it down," another woman shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. "Take it down, or you're no better than the rest of them." James froze for a moment, standing in the doorway of his cafe. The weight of their words hit him harder than he had anticipated. He had always known there would be opposition, but the sheer intensity of it, the venom in their voices, was something he hadn't been prepared for. These weren't just strangers who could be easily ignored. These were his people. His town. He had no idea how to respond. He wanted to speak to them, to explain that he hadn't wanted any of this, that he hadn't set out to betray them, but that wasn't enough anymore. His silence was seen as complicity, his hesitation as weakness. And in the face of this kind of anger, no words would be enough to change their minds. It was then that Deputy Collins arrived. James saw the familiar figure approach through the crowd, his presence offering a brief respite from the chaos. Collins had always been a calming influence, someone who knew how to handle tense situations. James had hoped for some guidance, a way out of this mess, but what Collins said next left him in a state of shock. "James," Collins said, his voice low but firm, "you need to get inside. Now." James hesitated, staring at the protesters, his mind racing. He knew the situation had reached a boiling point, but something about Collins's tone made him pause. There was a sense of urgency in his words that James couldn't ignore. He stepped back into the cafe, his heart pounding in his chest as the door closed behind him. "James, it's not safe," Collins said, following him inside. "I need you to listen. Things have escalated. The town council is meeting later today to discuss what to do with the cafe, and it's not looking good for you. People are calling for action, calling for you to be removed from the town's business community." James's stomach sank. "Removed? What does that mean?" "It means they want to shut you down," Collins said grimly. "They're already talking about boycotting the cafe, getting the town to stop coming here altogether. Some are even suggesting taking matters into their own hands. They want your sign gone, and they want you to make a choice: either you pull it down, or we all suffer the consequences." James felt as though the ground beneath him had been pulled away. This wasn't just about a business decision anymore. This wasn't just about a sign on a window. It was about survival. The survival of his cafe, of the community he had always been a part of. And in the middle of it all, he had to make a decision that would affect not just his future, but the future of everyone around him. "I can't just pull the sign down, Collins," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That would mean admitting I was wrong. It would mean everything I've worked for, the values I've built my business on, would be meaningless. I can't do that." Collins's eyes softened for a moment, and he placed a hand on James's shoulder. "I understand. But think about this: if you don't act now, things could spiral out of control. People are already turning on each other. Families are being torn apart. There's no way to predict what will happen if you don't make a decision soon." The words hung heavy in the air. James didn't know what to think. He had never been good at making quick decisions under pressure, but this felt like a choice he couldn't afford to get wrong. No matter what he chose, someone was going to lose. Someone was going to be hurt. And it would be his fault. "I need more time," James said, his voice shaking. "I can't do this right now. I can't choose." Collins didn't say anything. Instead, he gave James a long, heavy look before nodding and walking toward the door. "You don't have much time. You've got until the council meeting this afternoon. Think it over." And with that, he was gone, leaving James alone with his thoughts, the chaos of the world outside pressing in on him from all sides. The door slammed open as protesters continued to shout outside. The noise, the anger, the fear, everything felt like it was crashing in on him. James stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a storm cloud. His cafe, his community, his future, they were all on the line. And there was no turning back. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in Ridgeview grew unbearable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. James sat alone in the back of his cafe, his mind racing. The sounds of the protest outside had become a constant hum, punctuated by shouts and chants. His cafe, once a place of comfort and conversation, now felt like a battleground. His customers, once loyal friends and neighbors, were now divided, some siding with him, others demanding he remove the sign, threatening to take their business elsewhere. It was hard for him to recognize the town he had grown up in, the town that had supported his family for generations. Everything had changed in just a few days. As the clock ticked closer to the town council meeting, James felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The cafe, his livelihood, his father's legacy, it was all at risk. But it wasn't just his business that was at stake, it was the fabric of his community. The sign in the window had become a symbol of division, a line drawn in the sand. People weren't just protesting against a law anymore, they were protesting against each other. The very heart of Ridgeview was breaking apart, and James didn't know how to stop it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bell above the door jingling. He looked up to see Deputy Collins walking in, his expression grim. James didn't need to ask why he was here. The meeting was starting, and the pressure to make a choice was mounting. "James," Collins said softly, his voice full of empathy. "It's time." James stood up, his legs shaky. The decision he had been dreading was now unavoidable. He had no choice but to face the council, to make his case. But how could he convince them? How could he justify keeping the sign up when it was tearing the town apart? Could he live with himself if he backed down, or if he stood his ground? "I'm not ready," James admitted, his voice barely audible. Collins looked at him, his gaze firm yet understanding. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to decide what's right for you and your community. But whatever you decide, know that you're not alone in this. We're all in this together." The words felt hollow to James. How could he be part of a community when that very community was at war with itself? The protesters outside, the people who used to smile and wave at him, were now a source of fear. And yet, he knew he had to face them. He couldn't hide anymore. Not from them. Not from himself. With a heavy heart, James stepped out of the cafe, locking the door behind him. The streets were lined with people, their faces filled with anger, fear, and confusion. Some looked at him with disdain, while others gave him hopeful glances, silently pleading for him to make the right decision. James didn't know what the right decision was. All he knew was that the town was watching, waiting for him to lead them, and he had no idea what kind of leader he could be in this moment. The town hall loomed ahead, its stone walls casting a long shadow over the proceedings. Inside, the council members were already seated, their expressions stern. James took a deep breath and walked to the front, where he was greeted by a mix of silent glares and quiet nods. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, the judgment in their eyes. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Councilman Harrison, a man known for his sharp tongue and unwavering stance on most issues, was the first to speak. "James, we all know why we're here. The sign you put up in your cafe has caused division in this town. People are outraged, and they want answers. What do you have to say for yourself?" James swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I put the sign up because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought it would keep my cafe open, that it would protect my business from the law. But I never expected it to tear us apart. I never expected to see my friends and neighbors fighting with each other, calling each other names, threatening each other over something as simple as a sign. This isn't what Ridgeview is about. This isn't the town I know." Harrison sneered. "The town you know is changing, James. The world is changing. You can't keep living in the past. You have to make a choice. Either you take that sign down and apologize to the community, or you face the consequences. And believe me, the consequences will be severe." James's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the council on him, the pressure mounting. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. He had never been one to back down, but this wasn't a simple business decision. This was about his community, his family, and his future. "I'm not going to apologize for trying to survive," James said, his voice rising with emotion. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting to keep my cafe open, for wanting to protect my employees, for wanting to keep the business my father built alive. I'm not asking anyone to agree with me, but I am asking for respect." There was a long silence in the room. James could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Some of the council members exchanged glances, while others seemed lost in thought. Finally, Councilwoman Myers spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "James, you've made your point," she said. "But the question remains, will you take down the sign or not?" For a moment, James stood there, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. The fate of his business, his town, his community, it all hinged on this one choice. "I can't do it," James said, his voice trembling with resolve. "I can't take the sign down. But I'll work with you. I'll find a way to bridge the divide. But taking down the sign, that's not the solution. It's only going to make things worse." Councilman Harrison slammed his fist on the table. "You're making a mistake, James. You've chosen your side, and now you'll have to face the consequences." As James turned to leave the council meeting, he felt as though the walls were closing in on him. He had made his choice, but he knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos. The protests outside the cafe grew more intense, and the town was divided down the middle. People either rallied behind James, applauding his decision to stand firm, or they turned against him, calling him a traitor and a coward. The cafe became a symbol of resistance for some, and a symbol of defiance for others. James watched as Ridgeview changed before his eyes. His friends were now strangers, his neighbors now enemies. The cafe, once a gathering place for the town's heart, had become a battleground. And in the midst of it all, James stood alone, trying to hold on to what little was left of the community he once knew. The weeks that followed were filled with uncertainty. The pressure continued to mount, and James found himself questioning his decision every day. But deep down, he knew he had done what he thought was right. It wasn't easy. It wasn't popular. But it was his choice, and it was a choice that had changed everything. As the dust settled, and the town of Ridgeview began to heal, James realized that the true cost of his decision wasn't just the cafe or the sign, it was the cost of standing up for what he believed in, no matter the consequences. Ridgeview would never be the same, but neither would he. The man who had walked into that council meeting, unsure and fearful, was no longer the same man who walked out. And though the community was still divided, James knew that in time, they would find a way to come together. They had to. After all, in the face of adversity, what else could they do? In the end, James's choice had not only changed his life but had changed the life of Ridgeview. The town would never forget the man who stood up for his beliefs, even when it seemed impossible. And for James, that was enough.